over 9,700 breweries in the country these days, Taplines listener. It's a lot. Some say it's too many. This wasn't always the case. As historian Dave Burkhart told us in a previous episode, the notion of small, local, independent breweries churning out high-quality beers to match the culinary care of the slow foods movement was pretty much unheard of when Fritz Maytag took a controlling stake in San Francisco's Anchor Brewing Company in 1965. You should definitely go check out that episode if you haven't yet. It's called How America's First Craft Brewery Was Reborn. The episode you're about to hear stems directly from that rebirth. You'll hear Maytag's name a lot, which is no surprise given we're headed back to the Bay Area in the 1970s, but that era in Northern California was a cosmic craft brewing gumbo full of wide-eyed acolytes of full-flavored beer who would go on to varying degrees of fame and fortune in the years to come. So the other name you're going to hear on today's episode may not be so familiar. Jack McAuliffe, founder of Sonoma's New Albion Brewing Company, which, despite its brief, tiny operation, had an outsized influence on the craft brewing luminary set to emerge from the region. That brings us to our guest, Ken Grossman, a one-time homebrewing shop owner who would go on to found a little brewery in Chico, California called Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. He's joining us to tell the tale of Sierra Nevada's earliest days and how the disparate influences of Jack McAuliffe and Fritz Maytag helped him figure out how to keep his fledgling brewery alive and thriving. It's Ken Grossman, it's Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, it's the most important craft brewery you've never heard of, and it's all right here, right now, on VinePair's Taplines. I am one state away from Sierra Nevada's beautiful Malt Disney World in Mills River, North Carolina. I'm, of course, recording here at Taplines HQ in Richmond, Virginia. But I'm many states away from the man on the other end of the line who, to true beer heads, needs no introduction, but he's going to get one anyway. I'm talking, of course, about Ken Grossman. Ken, thank you so much for joining Taplines today.
Totally my pleasure. Love to talk about beer and the history of craft brewing and our business.
And we are going to be talking history, but in the here and now, before we scroll the Taplines time machine back to the late 70s, Ken, you're joining us from Chico today. Are you in the Sierra Nevada home base?
I am. I'm at the brewery today. I was back in North Carolina the last several days and came back here and dove back into our new project we're working on.
That's right. And you're going to be adding a ton of capacity with the new Can Do facility, which was reported. We're recording this in early summer 2023. I know that's a project that you guys have been pushing to get over the finish line, and is going to add a lot of capabilities to Sierra Nevada with Beyond Beer products, which are a cool new direction for Sierra to be going and staying ahead of the curve. But that's the future. And like I said, we're here to talk about the past, Ken. So we're going to take us back, to a period of time that was, I think for students of the industry, for true enthusiasts or people who have, quote unquote, done the reading, they're aware that the late 70s in Northern California were a formative moment for the entire industry as sort of Fritz Maytag had taken over Anchor about a decade prior and was starting to really get people to be a little bit more interested in this full flavored malty steam beer that he was putting out, be more interested in general in where the beer was coming from and who was making it. And into that milieu entered a brewer that we're going to be talking about today that I know you crossed paths with right around that time, a man named Jack McAuliffe, who would go on to found a brewery that is called New Albion. And despite not being one that's on the tip of everybody's tongue in the here and now today in 2023, was nonetheless, incredibly catalytic in terms of kicking off what we now come to recognize as the American craft brewing movement. So that is my long-winded lead-up question, Ken. And I'm going to shut up in a second because listeners are here to hear from you, not from me. They hear me every week. They don't need any more of me. Ken, take us, back to Northern California in the late 70s. Tell me, what you were up to and how you got into this whole micro brewing thing. And before micro brewing, I think it was home brewing, wasn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, I think I'll step back even another decade. So in the late '60s, late '60s, I grew up in a little town in Southern California. At least little at the time. It's grown significantly since then. And my neighbor, from when I was just a quite young kid, my schoolmate in elementary school's dad was a very accomplished home brewer, home winemaker, distiller. And so I was exposed to homebrewing back in the early 60s. And then I started to make a little bit of beer at home in 1969. And at that point in time, there was, obviously no craft beer. And there was very little really quality beer, at least being brewed in America. The beers were, I wouldn't say quality, not being bad quality, but interesting quality beers.
Right.
Beers were pretty much one style, light lager styles, not a lot of variation, and pretty much every brewery was making about the same kind of liquid.
Sure.
And so that was my exposure. Started out being exposed to homebrew and being exposed to esoteric small brands from Europe as well as the U.S. Just seeing them in my friend's fridge and my friend's dad's fridge. And so I started to homebrew a wide range of styles, and I moved to Chico in 1972. I took all my homebrewing supplies with me. I enrolled in chemistry at the junior college, and then eventually got convinced by a neighbor that I should open a homebrew supply store in Chico because there was no ingredients available, and my neighbors were enjoying my beers, and I would have to drive to the Bay Area. There was a homebrew shop, a couple of them in Berkeley, and then I'd go down and visit my mother, and there was one of the very first big home beer supply stores down in Southern California, where the Maltose Falcons actually started America's first homebrew club, and so I was exposed to sort of at least the cutting edge of homebrewing back in the late '60s, early '70s, and then I continued to perfect my homebrewing. Opened this homebrew supply store in '76, and then did make a pilgrimage first to visit Fritz down at the Anchor Brewery when he was still in the old facility, and ended up buying a number of cases of Old Foghorn, which were, at that point a very exceptional, super distinctive beer. I had been aware of steam beer right when Fritz started bottling, which I don't think was until around 70 or so. He bought the brewery in '65, but he initially didn't bottle.
Yeah, we just had Dave Burkhart, the Anchor Brewing historian, on to Taplines a few episodes ago, and listeners may remember that we talked through that as a key decision that Fritz made in that immediate aftermath of acquiring Anchor. So you had just gotten a couple cases of that newly bottled product.
Yeah, he was only selling it at the brewery, and it was sold to me by him directly, and it was in little small nip bottles, I remember, and it was an amazing liquid for the time, and certainly was way different than anything anybody else was brewing.
Yeah.
So I saw Fritz. I think I was probably in '77, maybe '78, and then made a trip to New Albion and saw what Jack McAuliffe was doing. And at that point in time, I thought, this is really an exciting thing to do for a career. I'd been a hobbyist brewer and owning the homebrew shop, and I'd been working in bicycle shops to support myself, but thought as far as a career path, the bike shop would be something I knew and would be easy, but I felt if I didn't try to open my own brewery, that I would probably regret it the rest of my life. So I sold the homebrew shop, wrote a business plan in 1978, and after seeing what Jack had built, realized some of his pitfalls. He built a barrel and a half capacity brewery, so roughly 45 gallons per batch. And it was he and Susie Stern running the business, and they did everything. I mean, they did all the brewing, they did the sales, they did the bottling. I mean, everything was totally done by hand. And actually, I remember on one of my trips to visit Jack, seeing his bedroom. He lived above the brew house. He had a little pull down, one of those attic ladders, and he would climb up there and sleep above the brewery. In part, I'm sure to save money, but on part also probably because he could keep an eye on fermentations and whatnot throughout the night.
Really living it.
Yeah, he was really living it. So, I mean, at that time, Jack, I think, had started in '77. And when we announced we were going to open a brewery, and the amount of brewers in America at that time was right about the low point. I think there were 43 or 44 breweries, brewing companies. There were more breweries because some of the big breweries had multiple facilities. But
ABI had just AB at that point had what 8, 9 maybe. Schlitz was building them as fast as they could. Of course, by that point also Schlitz was staring down the barrel of some bad cost cutting consequences coming home to roost. So their loss was AB's gain. But sorry to interrupt.
No, so a completely different time, and we started to I guess have a little community of the aspiring homebrewers, and between when Jack opened in 77 and we opened in 80, there were 6 of us that were sort of pioneering, and all of us were homebrewers trying to go commercial, other than Jim Schluter, who founded River City Brewing about that time in Sacramento. But there was Tom DeBacher, who was a fireman and homebrewer who opened up in Novato. There was Cartwright Brewing up in Portland. There was Boulder Brewing Company, and we were all about at the same stage. I think in 1978, maybe DeBacher was in operations, but everybody else was just talking about and figuring out how to build their breweries. And in that era, there was no equipment suppliers that were out there, so we were all fabricating. And I remember the Boulder Brewing folks came and spent the night at my house while they were in the construction and fact-finding mode. And we were, I guess, probably a little bit more fortunate. We had UC Davis quite close to us. And so I spent a lot of time down at the Davis Library and with Michael Lewis, who ran the brewing program. And then quite a few of his grad students, as they were coming through the program, would give us input, advice. They were working on their masters in brewing and had, studied the industry as it was at that time, and so gave us some input as to sort of how to steer our company for success. And after looking at what Jack had done with such a small volume, and he was struggling to make enough money to survive, it really wasn't a viable business plan at $1.50 barrels, even though he was commanding, I think at the time, close to $1 a bottle, which was outrageously expensive back in 1980.
Yeah, adjusted for inflation, that's something like those $28 4-packs that you see some of the hotshot small nano breweries putting out today.
Yeah, but there was no marketplace that was receptive to that at the time. He had a struggle, and it was a novelty, and so he immediately started to try to raise money, and was unable to really put a business plan together that would attract investors. And we were in the same boat. I mean, we wrote a business plan, and again, we thought 10 barrels, at least on paper, was a workable volume to support ourselves. I had a partner at the time, Paul Camuzzi, and the two of us, and we had one employee who did sales and packaging and everything else that was required to get the beer out the door. And even at a 10-barrel size, at least on our business plan, it showed we could make money. But when we took it to banks, they would look at it and say, "You guys are nuts." If they had studied the brewing industry, they would have seen that breweries were closing at a rapid rate from after Prohibition was repealed until the point when we wanted to open, and that was say down to 43 companies. And so from their standpoint, it was a horrible investment. None of us were able to borrow any bank money. So everybody had to get financing from family and friends and personal resources.
And this is a moment when the beer industry is going through its most significant contraction, really, in the history of the American beer industry. If you don't count Prohibition, obviously, because that was not a contraction so much as a regulatory action. But as regional breweries and local breweries, struggle to compete mostly with Anheuser-Busch, to some extent Schlitz, who have cracked the code on national advertising, on building breweries with enormous economy of scale in markets that they think are lucrative. So as those breweries close, their capacity is either being gobbled up by Anheuser-Busch or Schlitz, and to some extent Miller obviously is once Miller gets acquired by Philip Morris and they roll out Miller Lite, which we spoke about with historian Maureen Ogle on a previous Taplines episode. But Ken, so you're in this moment, you're going into the banks and you're saying, hey, this is our business plan. They're saying, no way, go find money somewhere else. This is never going to work. But you're also looking at, you've got Fritz, who has, sort of known as the gentleman brewer. He's interested and curious in turning Anchor around, very passionate about it, but he's also a Maytag, obviously, so he's got a little bit of a different, financial arrangement than most entrepreneurs do, and certainly than you did at the time. And then you're looking at one of the other few examples that's in your immediate sphere in California at this time in the late 70s is Jack McAuliffe, who, as you've described and has been reported, and I think even Jack himself in accounts, years later would say, we weren't doing it the right way, or we were struggling to make money, or, sort of seeing the challenges that New Albion was facing. And you still were like, all right, let's do this thing with Sierra Nevada. I think we've got it. 1 barrel, maybe not 10 barrels. I think we can do it. Where did you get the confidence, man?
Well, it was one of those things where we thought that the fact there had been so much consolidation in the industry that it really opened up sort of the niche. And California at the time was a fairly progressive place, at least the Bay Area certainly, with cheese, artisan cheese makers and coffee roasters and artisan bread bakers and all these sort of craft centric approaches to what had become very much commodities in our country. I mean, Wonder Bread and the homogenous beer scene and wines that weren't very interesting or exciting or of super high quality. All that was starting to turn around. So there was starting to be a movement of artisan craftsmanship of sort of historic food and drink that was coming back. So we saw that there was a growing level of appreciation of things that have substance and flavor and character. And so we thought, we don't need to sell a lot of beer. We only need to sell a fraction of a percent of beer. And imports at that point were, available in most markets. There was a range of singles, actually a pretty wide range in some stores of individual bottles. There weren't a lot of, major volume imported brands, but you could get a wide range. You could get a wide range of offerings back then.
What are we talking about? Like obviously Heineken, and then you got Beck's, Pilsner Urquell. Like what else are we talking about there?
Sam Smith's. I mean, there were a lot of British imports. Charlie Finkel at Merchant of Inn had started to import Eyinger and a number of those brands in that time as well.
Gotcha.
So you could go to a better liquor store and find 50 imported beers ranging from very esoteric styles for the time, at least in the U.S. marketplace, to some of the more mainstream brands like the ones you mentioned, Beck's and Heineken.
Sure. Yeah.
So people were exposed to different beers. If you were a beer fan at the time, you could experiment with different beer styles other than American Light Lager. But again, certainly a small segment of the U.S. beer marketplace at the time.
Yeah.
So we thought that an American made and obviously what Fritz was doing was starting to resonate. My buddy who I'd mentioned in the beginning had been a home brewer. He got his hands on Anchor Steam right when they first started bottling Anchor Steam beer and shared it with us. And it was, obviously a very unique and interesting offering compared to what else was being brewed in the U.S. And I remember there were still a few old holdouts, Ballantine's India Pale Ale. You could still find, I think, brewed out of the Narragansett Brewery. And it had character and flavor and was dry hopped. So there were a few samplings of American beers that were of note as far as being outside the norm. So we thought there was a growing place for a small brewery that hopefully had enough volume to support itself, as New Albion didn't. And we just thought it was an opening and a time, and we were going to be at the beginning of it. And we were in a college town, and one of our thoughts was, we could appeal to, the graduating seniors, and it actually worked out very much to our advantage. Of a lot of people came to Chico to go to school from the Bay Area, from LA, from other cities, and having this hometown brewery that we became part of the fabric of the community. People would drink our beer and then go back home to where they had
graduate,
grown up, and sort of have a love for Sierra Nevada. So it seeded the marketplace as the college kids graduated and went back home. And so we started to get a real Bay Area connection. We got our beer in Chez Panisse as one of the first, I guess, impressive retail restaurants to be selling a craft beer, because they thought, we were bottle conditioned, we were naturally brewed, it aligned with what their food sensibilities were. And after that happened, then we started to, sort of be able to show other restaurants and bars that, we were a quality product and belonged to be on tap lists. I mean, back in 1980, most places that had draft beer would carry, one or two or maybe three domestic brands, and didn't have, open taps. So the places we found acceptance on draft was really more like the Irish bars, where they were used to having, a Guinness or a Murphy's or something on tap, and so quite often had multiple taps at those accounts. And so we started to get some traction there. And then there started to be, in the early 80s, a few craft-centric bars that at least would have a few craft beers that were available. And it was Anchor, it was us. By 81, New Albion had closed, so they left the scene. I think by 82, there were 9 or 10 small brewers in America, but a few of the early ones had already gone. Cartwright was gone, and DeBacher was gone, and New Albion was gone. So there was a pretty rapid changing of the guard that happened for the first 10 years, really, where brewers came and went just due to the challenges of making beer consistently, as well as selling beer and making money at it. So there was a lot of failures those early years.
Sure. I want to talk a little bit, Ken. Sierra Nevada opens in 1979, and you discussed sort of those early years. You won a big account at Chez Panisse, which I'm sure at the time must have felt like you were riding high on top of the world. That's a big one. Obviously, Alice Waters, extremely influential, a Northern California restaurant that they opened or at the beginning of that decade, I think 1971 or so. But I want you mentioned earlier in the episode about sort of observing, because you, I think, visited at least as reports show, you visited New Albion a couple times as you were sort of solidifying your business plan, that business model that you took to the banks that they didn't want any part of, that I'm sure they're still kicking themselves over to this day. But you mentioned sort of these pitfalls that you saw, that Jack, working hard at this, obviously has the passion for it, but it's just not going to go with the arrangement that he's got. And one of the things that we've already touched on is sort of this question of volume, right? Like, it sounds like pretty quickly you became hip to the idea that, there's maybe there are savings that you can capture with economies of scale if you're brewing at, a larger volume. Obviously, 10 barrels is not large compared to the big guys then or now, but is big compared to Jack's setup at New Albion. So that's one of the pitfalls that you sort of saw him struggling with. What were the others? Was it like undercapitalization? Was it a marketing thing? Like, tell me a little bit about sort of like how you learned from his pioneering sort of, going first and breaking the ice.
Yeah, so none of us had any money. I mean, everybody was seriously bootstrapped. Every one of the six of us who opened up, nobody had any backing. So it was all family and friends' money. And at that time too, I mean, that's when interest rates went to over 18%, and so if you were even able to borrow from a bank, I think they got to 21%. I think in 81 or so. If you were able to borrow from a bank, with a floating kind of loan, would have been almost impossible to repay. And so maybe some of the people,
wow.
Yeah, maybe some of the people did take some bank financing or maybe mortgaged their houses or something. I don't know all the details of all of us, but it would not have been a good time to get much leverage on a business like that. So yeah, no money, no marketing. None of us knew how to market. I mean, it was, if you had a POS, matter of fact, I don't have one in my office right now, but our early POS signs were hand painted. So we had little plaques we would hang in the pubs, and they were all hand painted. And they were sort of cool that way, but we only had like 10 accounts or so, so you could have somebody do the work.
Yeah.
But the challenges at 10 barrels were still enormous. The original business plan we had was to brew 12 brews a month, and 12 10-barrel brews a month. And then if we thought we could grow the business, was to expand up to 2,500 barrels a year. So about 24 brews a month. And that was the extent of our growth plan that was baked into our original business plan. The issue was at 10 barrels a month, we couldn't survive. Or 10 barrels of brew, 12 brews a month. That was not enough volume to cover costs, just to operate and live. And I kept working a second job at a bike shop for the first year because there was so little cash flow. So we rapidly realized we better expand now or we're going to go out of business. And we were watching, our peers, the guys at Boulder and that's the other ones I mentioned. Everybody was in the same boat that either you got to have another job, which the Boulder guys did. One of them was a college professor, and I can't remember what the other one did. But and it was a hobby at that point. It wasn't your livelihood. And
right.
For us, we had pretty much gotten out of everything else we were doing other than me working part-time at the bike shop. And so if we were going to survive as brewers, we better make more beer. Just the amount of things we didn't plan for in our business plan, the costs. I had all these details as to, kilowatts of power to brew a batch of beer and therms and gas rates and all these things that I thought I was being very smart and calculated down to the nth degree. None of that held true. I mean, everything costs way more. On paper,
it was a good effort.
Yeah, on paper it seemed to make sense, but in reality, I was totally wrong in all these things. And so it was almost immediately all hands on deck to figure out how to expand. And we said it to ourselves, if we don't grow, we're going to die. And so we doubled the fermenting capacity, and that got us to a point where we were at least able to take some money home. And then we pretty quickly said we got to grow again. And in I think 83, end of 82, beginning of 83, I went to Germany and bought a 100-barrel brew house that I had found through some contacts we had actually in the brewing industry. Garrett at St. Stan's Brewery, he had family in Germany in the town that made Hoopman brew houses, and or the next town over. So they connected with them, and they found a used 100-barrel brew house, and so we bought the brew house and shipped it back to Chico. And I wrote another business plan and shopped that around, and still nobody would loan us any money. They're like, you're making, you're barely profitable, you're making almost no money. Yeah. And you want to borrow $1 million, I think was what we were asking for, and they just laughed at us again and said, "There's no way, this is not enough of a business to invest in." And so we actually kept the equipment that I bought in Germany in wooden crates, and we continued to figure out how to make more beer. And so we added more fermenters, and we were in this little 3,000 square foot metal building we leased. And in a little industrial park, sort of
in Chico there.
In Chico, yeah. Not a real metal Quonset buildings, uninsulated, summer heat, all that. I mean, it was
winter cold. Not
the ideal place. But luckily, there were a couple warehouses around us, and so we were able to rent another warehouse when we had a little bit of extra cash flow, and then add some more tanks, and then we actually started going with outdoor conical tanks that we could stub through the wall of the metal building. When we left that building, it was like Swiss cheese. There were holes everywhere, walls, ceilings, stacks running out, vents.
He must have been popular with the landlord. Yeah.
Well, he came at one point and was shocked, and he said, I'm going to double your security deposit, which was, I don't know, $2,500 or something. And we said, okay, fine. And and that allowed us just to leave at the end. So I'm not sure. And for us, it was a hell of a good deal. For him, I don't think so. But
that works out. Well,
yeah.
Wait, but Ken, so the equipment piece of the puzzle is something that really interests me because I know at this time, we think about now when you're starting a brewery in 2023 or really any time in the past 10 to 15 years, there was a pretty well-established route to, sort of getting the equipment you need to build out a operational brewing facility, right? Like you can look on online brokerage listings. There are places that'll manufacture it new for you. Anything you need, right? From small all the way up to a massive brew house, of course. That was not the case when Jack, when your other peers in Northern California at the time were starting up. So when you say you expanded fermenting capacity, when you say you rented this other warehouse, where was the stuff coming from? Where was your equipment coming? Besides Germany, obviously you went to Germany and bought some stuff, but excluding that piece, where was the stuff coming from?
Well, the initial fermenters I welded myself, so I enrolled in welding at the junior college, and they had all the equipment I needed because I didn't own it at the time initially, and we bought welders later. But so I had a company who made agricultural stainless steel tanks, roll up some stainless for me, and I climbed inside and welded all the tanks up myself for the first couple of rounds of them. But we leaned pretty heavily on the dairy industry. There were a lot of small dairies around the Northern California up into Oregon and Washington that had surplus tanks and pumps, and his dairies had gone out of business, and they had a milking operation with a milk storage tank and a process pump and pipe, and so we grabbed a lot of that stuff. And then as we grew to a certain point, I bought Fritz Maytag's bottle filler when he did his expansion to Potrero Hill, and it actually, Fritz had bought it used out of the Siebens Brewery in Chicago. And one of Al Capone's reported breweries that was controlled.
Concerns, yeah.
And so we bought it when he upgraded, and then actually I sold that to the Mad River Brewers up in the Humboldt area, and I think they're still using it. So that was a 1952 bottle filler.
That thing made the rounds.
Yeah, still filling bottles. So
Cool.
We started to find some cast off stuff. The malt mill I bought actually came out of the George Ott Brewery in Pennsylvania, and it was from 1902. And it had been in the brewery since before Prohibition, and it was funky. It had babbited bearings, which are the bearings that they put in Model A's that are cast out of tin and lead. And I found a Model A rebuilder to repour the bearings for this malt mill.
So you're just cobbling together like this island of misfit, equipment here. How were you hearing about it? I assume like you were talking to Jack, you might have been talking to the folks at Boulder, talking to Cartwright. Was there kind of a network of guys who would get on the phone and be like, "Hey, I know you're looking for this over here. I just saw one of these." Like, how were you finding out? Because like you weren't going around to every single dairy farm in Northern California, were you?
Yes. On the dairy side, this was pre-internet, so you couldn't do a Google search for stuff.
Right.
So I would go. I was remembering this the other day for a talk I gave. So I would go to the phone company, and there used to be one phone company in the country, and they had yellow pages for the whole U.S. So I would go through, sit and go through the yellow pages, looking at feed stores, and I came up with a pretty good plan where I'd go to a town and ask the feed store if where the old dairies were in the area, and they'd say so and so up the road there, he used to milk cows. You might talk to him. So I would actually go drive and knock on doors and say, "You got any old pumps or pipe or tanks or anything?" And so I picked up a bunch of it that way. But one thing, when I started to get engaged in the U.S. brewing industry, Fritz Maytag actually encouraged me to join the Brewers Association of America, which is the forerunner of what is now the BA, what Charlie Papazian had founded as the homebrew and initial craft brewing trade group.
Yeah.
But the old BAA had been founded right during the war, and it was founded because small brewers at the time during World War II couldn't get bottle caps. The tin plate that was being used for making bottle caps was one of those commodities that got rationed for the war effort. And the big brewers were able to get bottle caps, but the little guys didn't have the clout to convince a manufacturer that they were worthy to get bottle cap material.
Sure.
And so the BAA was brought together, and it was essentially all the small brewers in America that had survived Prohibition and were now trying to keep their businesses going through the war. And so Fritz said, you should join this organization. It's really the place where America's small brewers come together. So I joined that, I think, in '83, and went to my first convention in Florida. And there I met, the commercial brewing industry. Up until that point, I knew, obviously knew the few small brewers that were in America. And Fritz would have parties every year at the brewery, and he would invite pretty much all the small brewers in America to his party. And I remember, being there. The anchor band would be playing. They had a rock and roll band with brewery employees, and Jack would be out on the fire escape roasting Sonoma sausages that he picked up at one of the hometown artisan sausage makers. So I have some fond memories of some of those parties going into the night with the band playing and us hanging out drinking beer together.
That's so lovely,
When I got hooked up with the BAA, so that was a place where suppliers also went. And again, all the suppliers and small brewers, there weren't a lot of either, but the maltsters would be there. And a lot of these were family-owned breweries and family-owned businesses, the Rahr family and a number of the supply chain people that I got to meet, the CEOs of the owners and founders would go to those conferences. So you started to build relationships with the legacy brewing industry. So all the old post-prohibition or pre and post-prohibition breweries that were in the country at the time, and then also the legacy suppliers. So the hops and malts and bottle caps and all that. So you got a direct connection with the CEOs. And so that really helped bridge that knowledge gap. And then it was easy to go call somebody up and say, I'm looking for some lab equipment. Do you have any old lab equipment that may be, suitable for a small brewer to get their hands on? So I started to build that kind of relationship. And the big brewers and the Coors family were very gracious and said, come use our research library. They actually offered to make fermenters for us at one point in time in the 80s.
Really?
They Coors, I don't think they still do, but they had their own tank fabrication shop.
For a long time, yeah.
And they had offered to build fermenters for us, but out of our budget, we couldn't afford new fermenters at that point. But
luxury.
When we eventually did, we started to use some of the U.S. manufacturers that Fritz actually had recommended. So DCI company in St. Cloud, Minnesota, built our first fermenters, and Fritz had a relationship with them from the Maytag dairy farm that his family had founded. So they were buying milk tanks and cheese tanks and that from DCI. Mm-hmm. And so we did, as we grew, we did start to buy some new equipment from U.S. manufacturers that specialized in custom kind of building. But to your earlier point, so no, you could not buy a brew house for a 10-barrel brew house, at least not in this country. Maybe you could have had somebody in Germany or the UK build one for you. But it would have been so cost prohibitive for any of us that it was really out of the question that we could actually buy purposely built equipment back in the really early days. It was just well out of anybody's budget.
What time around? Where are we talking about here? It sounds like we've scrolled forward a little bit to the mid '80s when you started establishing.
Mid '80s, we were starting to grow, and I say I bought this brew house in Germany and couldn't install it, and we were.
So it was just sitting in boxes.
Sitting in a big wooden crate. I can send you a picture of us standing in front of it.
I would love that.
It sat there for like 4 years until we. Man. And so I figured out how to. We were very fortunate. The San Francisco Examiner ran a multiple page color article about the brewery that's making Chico famous. And it was Paul and I sitting out on some kegs out in a field with our beers in front of us. And that gave us just this huge shot in the arm as far as just the market awareness. And right about the same time, some of the grocery chains in the Bay Area were starting to catch on. They were starting to stock a lot of boutique wineries. And so they had a beer section. And I don't know that it was a separated craft beer section, but they had a beer section that probably had us with imports at the time. And so they started advertising, much to our shock sometimes, there'd be an ad that they would run, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, $4.99 a six pack or whatever it was back in the day. Yeah. And all of a sudden our sales just took off. And so then we really had to figure out how to make more beer. And so I increased the size of the kettle to, I think, 16 and a half, 17 barrels. I bought some new open tanks for the first time, buying new tanks from JV Northwestern up in Oregon, 35-barrel tanks. I put 4 of those in, and then I started adding these outdoor storage tanks as well. And so we just started really cranking the little 10-barrel brewery that had been designed for 2,500 barrels or so. We got up to over 10,000 out of that brew house. And
wow.
And I sold that to Mad River as well with the bottle filler. And they brewed on it for the next 30 years, or almost 30 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Holy smokes!
And I got it back, and all by hand with a canoe with a canoe paddle. I mean, there was no automation at all. You would dump them all in, and you'd stir it in with a canoe paddle. And they brewed. I think we figured they brewed 23,000. Let's see, was that 23,000 batches, something like that? So wow. It's brewed hundreds of thousands of barrels on this little primitive system. I brewed on it for 8 years, and then they brewed on it much longer.
Yeah. Holy smokes. That is getting your money's worth out of that equipment.
So by 1987, we had gone over 10,000 barrels. And at that point in time, we had enough of a track record. We could finally get an SBA loan. And so we had some support on the building from the contractor and my partner's mother. And then we borrowed $1 million, I think, from the SBA, and that was enough to build sort of where we are today, the start of where we are today on 20th Street. And
that was 8 years in is when the SBA finally deigned to issue you a loan.
Yeah. Actually, 10 years when we started the business paper, but 8 years of brewing. And so when I designed that brewery, I mean, we were at, I say, a little over 10,000 barrels when we designed it. And we still didn't have a lot of money. And so we picked up a small piece of property, less than 2 acres, and designed the brewery to fill that spot up. And, at that point, I think Fritz was probably at close to 40,000 barrels. And so I designed, our future expansion plans to get to 60,000 barrels, which at the time seemed like a really lofty goal. I mean, nobody had done that. And, Boston Beer was in business at that point, but they were, totally different business model, all contract brewed. They didn't brew any of their own and any of their own beer at all. I think Pete's Wicked Ale maybe had started up by then as well, and same deal, contract brewing. But nobody had really gone and built a brand and a plant to do 60,000 barrels. Mm. So that seemed like, that's way out there in the future as to when we would ever get that big, if ever. And I think I was quoted as saying, I think there's a market in the U.S. for maybe 15,000 barrels of hoppy beer. So I can't remember what year I said that. I haven't found the quote, but I do remember saying that was going to be nirvana if we could ever grow that big, and if we could find enough people to enjoy hoppy beer. So
it was beyond your wildest imagination at that time. There just wasn't any indication that it would grow that big. No. Wow.
No. So anyway, we designed for 60,000 barrels, and I think our first year operating there, we brewed about 20,000. Our next year, we were almost 35,000. The year after that, I think we were close to 50,000, and then we were out of capacity again. That happened. That happened really rapidly, and we didn't have. I said we had less than 2 acres of land, so we didn't have any room to expand, and we started to. Thankfully, in our little area, there was vacant lots around us, so we started to buy an acre when we could afford it and attach it onto our facility, and then add a fermentation room or a loading dock or some more warehousing. And so we were able to grow that way for really the next almost 30 years of just acquiring little bits of land as we could afford it. Generally, they didn't have buildings on them. We bought some that did have some buildings on them and repurposed them. So now we've grown to almost a 40-acre campus here in Chico. And then, decided at some point that shipping beer from California to New York and Texas and Florida and all the eastern areas at some point was going to be not a wise thing to be dependent on. Just energy costs, carbon footprint, all those things weighed on us that we better, if we're going to be a national brand, we better think about brewing in a couple different coasts. So we added the brewery in North Carolina about 2012. We broke ground out there.
How many acres is that?
230.
Yeah, so dramatically larger than the Chico.
Yeah.
The Chico
but
campus.
we're only developed on about 30 acres, so the rest of it's just still wild and
it's a beautiful location. Like I said at the beginning of the episode here,
Yeah.
I've been out there, and it lives up to the billing. It's you guys have done a tremendous job with that. It's really something to behold.
We have goats and sheep and chickens and all that out there too. So we got a little farming operation and gardens along with the brewery.
Very cool. Ken, in sort of like as we I'm looking at the clock here, and I could talk to you for another 3 hours, but I bet you got better stuff to do, and I know our listeners are anxious to hear sort of us bring it all back home. I'm curious. By the time you get to the late '80s, you're buying up parcels of land in Chico. This thing is starting to work. It's not nearly the scale that it is, of course, in the present day, but you're proving that there's a viable business here. And then just a moment ago we were talking about Sierra Nevada as a national brand, and it's one of the few national craft beer brands that sort of was able to establish and hold on to that footprint and that stature, and doing it all while staying independent and not, being acquired by a strategic partner or taking on private equity money or whatever the case may be. But that trajectory is dramatically different than the one, that we opened this conversation with. And I want to revisit, if you'll indulge me. We mentioned briefly that I think it was 1982 or maybe 1981 that New Albion and Jack McAuliffe, the brewery closed. Like there wasn't, it just, for all the reasons that we've discussed over the course of this conversation, it just wasn't working. In 1981, early 80s there, you're at Sierra Nevada, you're still fledgling. You're still well upstream of any of this, sort of validating success you would have by the end of that decade, and of course in the next one to come. Um, Tell me a little bit about, sort of when you heard the news, or when, if you were talking to Jack at that time, or, New Albion closes. What does that mean for your business? Do you worry? I presume you might be a little upset. Like, take me there. Like, tell me what the significance was.
Yeah, say by then, 2 or 3 small breweries had already closed. So the first wave was already starting to shake out. There were a couple things that we pointed to as to why we didn't think we were going to be in the same boat. I mean,
Yep.
We had a bigger business to start. So we knew that, Jack's 1.5 barrel design was pretty flawed, and he admitted it. I mean, he told us that
right.
You can't survive off 1.5 barrels. So we knew if he didn't raise money, he was going to not be able to continue on, and he was not successful in raising money. And again, going back to that time, he didn't have probably family and friends that had the wherewithal and or the faith that he could figure out how to pull this off, and so therefore probably didn't get much investment from family and friends. And and we struggled, as I mentioned. We couldn't get money to expand when we bought that new brew house, and we did go, talk to banks. We talked to strategic partners, talked to some venture people at the time. One of them was, I won't say the brand, but one of the water companies was interested in giving us some money. but they wanted 51%. And and Jack probably ran into the same thing, that anybody willing to sort of take a flyer on this industry would want a majority for their investment. They wouldn't want to be a minority partner and watch their money get piddled away without any ability to sort of steer the ship.
Sure.
So it was just hard to raise money then. And, for us, we had a growing business, so we grew every year. So we just realized that we needed to figure out how to grow at a rate that we could manage with cash flow. So pretty much all of our growth was, we plowed every penny back in that we made. And I think some of my peers were better capitalized that were coming along, Red Hook being one of them I can think of, and then Widmer and a few of these other breweries did have more access to capital. And in some cases, it probably hurt them because they took the money, but maybe didn't build as much of a war mentality and a cost-cutting, do-it-yourself attitude.
Yeah.
One of the first things I bought was a lathe, and I would buy all these old stainless steel fittings at a scrapyard down in the Central Valley, and I'd cut the pipe up, cut the ends off, remachine them, weld them back on myself. And so I had to, out of just necessity, learn how to really be scrappy. And I think a few of my peers, came from maybe the marketing side of the business. I think Paul Shipman from Red Hook was, he was into coffee and wine, but on the sales and marketing side, not on the production side. And I was focused on making beer. And so there was a disconnect there, I think, from some of my peers as far as what was important. Quality control and consistency was one of the things that most of the small players struggled with. And we were pretty buttoned down for our time and scale. We had a laboratory, we did plating, we propagated our own yeast. A lot of the things we were doing were I wouldn't say cutting edge, but they were what you needed to do as a small brewer to make sure you had consistency and quality in your beer. And I think some of our peers missed that. Either they didn't have the money, equipment, or knowledge. Again, we leaned on UC Davis, so we had a lot of support, and there was a big resource there that we could mine for how to make consistent beer. So I think that was part of why we thought we could sort of succeed where others had failed. And then something about our brand just seemingly resonated. The Grateful Dead sort of glommed on to Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And so the Dead had concerts. Every time where the Dead would play, we'd get a call from a distributor saying, "Oh, I need 2 pallets of beer. The Dead are coming." And we had nothing to do with that. It was just a great coincidence that the Deadheads love Pale Ale. And so we had these things that were sort of happening with the brand that we didn't have to drive. We didn't have any marketing money. We did no marketing at all for years and years. And so some of that stuff was just sort of fortunate timing and coincidence.
And some of it was baked into the business model from the beginning. You took the learnings of what you saw at New Albion and you tried to future-proof the business so the things that Jack was struggling with would not be things that you guys were struggling with when you opened up. Yeah. Gotcha.
And then, Fritz was a pretty good beacon for the industry at the time. He was, he got a fair amount of publicity, and he was, sort of breaking ground for many of us. I remember him telling me at one point he wanted to be more like the Guinness of brands, where you could, not widely distributed, but you could get it pretty much anywhere around the world. And a small distribution and a novel brand, but it was regarded and known far and wide. And so I think he was sort of leading that way, that you don't have to sell a lot of beer in any one place, but you need to sell enough beer and build your cred of your brand, and and that was the liquid and the brand imagery.
Ken, last question before we wind down this fantastic Taplines episode. And again, thank you so much for joining us. But we've talked about, of course, Sierra Nevada's founding and early years. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who understands even iota of how the beer industry works who wouldn't say that Sierra Nevada is one of the most influential breweries that's sort of ever brewed beer in the U.S. I think it's in that peer group with another brewery that we've spoken about a lot on this episode, which is Anchor Brewery, of course, founded in almost a full century before Sierra Nevada, revitalized under Fritz Maytag's stewardship starting in 1965. Again, one of those sort of like titans, or it's in the canon as far as sort of shaping the beer industry. And you've been so generous with your time and candor to sort of describe how that came to be. New Albion, by contrast, again, doesn't get as much name recognition because it was such a brief moment in time, because it was just kind of this tiny little operation, and yet it did have some key influence, even just because it was in the right place at the right time. My question, with that long lead in here, is, in hindsight, we're in 2023 now, reflecting on everything that we've just talked about in this episode. Can you sum up to me like what Jack McAuliffe's New Albion, what the influence was, what that significance of that brewery was? Obviously not a commercial success, but nevertheless part of the fabric of this industry. Tell me where it fits in for you.
Well, I think if Fritz bought an existing brand and an existing brewery, although the original brewery was quite funky,
right.
at least the one I saw, where I think Jack bridged the home brewing to commercial brewing worlds. And looking at Fritz's place, I probably wouldn't have thought I can do this myself. But going and looking at Jack's place, it was a very cool homebrew setup. And today there are home brewers that are way more sophisticated than what Jack had built, with temperature control and automation and a whole bunch of stuff today that was not available, or certainly couldn't have been afforded by some of the early pioneers. So I think Jack showed that you can be a home brewer essentially and go pro. And so I think that's what sort of sparked me, was that what he had built was not too far away from my homebrew setup, and I could see how I could take it to the next level and make a 10-barrel batch under the same sort of primitive brewing methodology. So I think it just showed that there was a path to commercialize a homebrew setup and hopefully make a business out of it. So I think it was just a stepping stone of the fact that the technology didn't have to be that scary, and it didn't have to be, gleaming 10,000 barrel tanks like Anheuser-Busch had, which I had obviously toured those big breweries as well. Yeah. But it just showed that you can do this on a small scale. You can make great beer. You can do it all yourself, and you don't need a ton of resources to enter the industry under those conditions. And so I guess it was probably the nudge just to witness what he had done and built that allowed me to see my path to opening a commercial brewery. I think if I'd only gone to established breweries, regardless of where they were, how big they were in the U.S., I would have seen a more daunting example, and it would not have thought I could have copied that.
Well, I'm glad you didn't, and I'm sure everyone who enjoys Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and the many, many other beers that have come from the portfolio over the years is glad you didn't get scared off, and is glad that you saw Jack McAuliffe's tiny little operation in New Albion, and it made it real for you that you could go on and launch Sierra Nevada. Ken Grossman, thank you so much for joining us on Taplines. We really can't thank you enough. This was a treat for our listeners. It's a treat for me, man. Thanks so much for stopping by. Come back anytime.
My pleasure. Very enjoyable.
All right, man. Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.